Frozen newborn, abandoned Frenchville, Maine, 1985. When a Siberian Husky named Paca gently carried the lifeless body of an infant girl through the snow to her owner's doorstep on December 7, 1985. Nobody imagined this heartbreaking discovery would haunt Aroostook County for nearly 4 decades. The temperature had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero that morning. Armand and Lorraine Pelletier stood paralyzed, staring at what their beloved dog had brought home. What appeared at first glance to be a discarded doll turned out to be something far more devastating. A frozen baby girl with strawberry blonde hair, still attached to several inches of umbilical cord, abandoned in the brutal Maine winter. This wasn't just another tragic news story that would fade from memory. This was the beginning of a mystery that would consume generations of investigators, break the hearts of an entire community, and ultimately showcase how modern forensic science can reach back through time to deliver justice that seemed impossible. But here's what nobody expected. The person responsible had been living a seemingly normal life, hundreds of miles away, for all those years, raising 2 daughters, celebrating birthdays, attending graduations, while the tiny victim she left behind lay nameless in an unmarked grave. The scene that greeted Maine State Police that frigid December morning painted a picture of desperation and tragedy. Armand Pelletier would later tell the Bangor Daily News that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "I saw what looked like a little rag doll," he recalled, his voice still heavy with emotion decades later. But then the horrifying reality set in. This wasn't a toy. This was a frozen little baby, unclothed, unswaddled, exposed to elements that no living creature could survive for long. The couple had always dreamed of having children of their own. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. A dog had brought them the baby they'd longed for, but only after it was far too late. Detectives immediately began tracing Paca's paw prints backward through the snow, following the trail that would lead them to the birthplace of this tragedy. The path extended roughly 700 feet from the Pelletier home, winding through the winter landscape until it terminated at a gravel pit just off Route 1. There, investigators discovered a scene that would be seared into their memories forever. A substantial pool of blood stained the frozen ground. A human placenta lay abandoned in the road leading to the pit. Tire tracks and footprints marked the area where, based on all evidence, this baby girl had entered the world alone, in darkness, in temperatures that would kill an adult within hours. The medical examiner's report delivered findings that made the situation even more heartbreaking. Dr. George Chase's autopsy revealed that this wasn't a stillborn infant or child with life-threatening complications. This baby girl weighed 6.5 pounds. She measured 18.5 inches long. She had been born full-term and healthy. She had every chance at life. But then something happened, or more accurately, something didn't happen. Nobody wrapped her in warm blankets. Nobody cut and clamped her umbilical cord properly. Nobody rushed her to a hospital. Nobody called for help. Instead, this full-term, healthy newborn was left exposed in a gravel pit where the wind chill had reached levels that retired State Trooper Jim Madore would later describe as unsurvivable. She couldn't have survived long. As brutally cold as it was, Madore told reporters, stating what everyone already knew but struggled to comprehend. The cause of death was listed as exposure to the cold, but that clinical terminology couldn't capture the real question burning in everyone's mind. Who would do this? What circumstances could possibly lead someone to give birth alone in a gravel pit and then simply drive away, leaving their newborn to freeze in the December night? The investigation began immediately, but it quickly hit walls that seemed insurmountable. Before we dive into this story, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. Frenchville in 1985 was the kind of tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so people thought. With a population hovering around 1,000 residents, secrets should have been impossible to keep. But then, here was the most devastating secret imaginable, and nobody seemed to know anything. Maine State Police canvassed the area, interviewed residents, checked hospital records, and followed every lead that emerged. They came up empty. No woman in the area had recently given birth without medical supervision. No teenagers had exhibited signs of pregnancy. No suspicious behavior had been reported in the days leading up to December 7th. It was as if the baby had materialized out of thin air, except for the very real blood and placenta that proved otherwise. Sergeant Charles Love was one of the initial investigators on the case, responding to that December call that would define much of his career. I remember responding to it that December day that was so very cold, Love recalled years later. But what he remembered most vividly wasn't just the brutal weather or the tragic scene. It was the lack of leads that came in. The silence from the community wasn't malicious. People genuinely wanted to help. There was a lot of people willing to help, but information was very scarce, Love explained. The case took on a life of its own within the department. Detectives refused to let it go cold, even as weeks turned into months. And months turned into years. The baby became known as Baby Jane Doe, a placeholder designation that would stick for 37 years. She was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Pleasant Catholic Cemetery in Bangor. Her true identity unknown, her story unfinished, but investigators never forgot her. The case file remained open, a constant reminder that somewhere out there someone knew exactly what happened on that December night in 1985. But then technology evolved in ways that the 1985 investigators couldn't have imagined. When baby Jane Doe was born, DNA fingerprinting was barely emerging as a forensic tool. The first DNA-based conviction in the United States had occurred just months earlier. The concept of using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases didn't exist. But decades later, breakthrough cases like the Golden State Killer demonstrated how DNA databases originally created for people searching for their ancestors could become powerful tools for law enforcement. Maine State Police had carefully preserved DNA evidence from the scene. They had the foresight to understand that even though current technology couldn't identify the mother, future technology might. That decision would prove crucial. The case periodically resurfaced in the media, especially during anniversary years. Each time, investigators hoped someone would come forward with information. Each time, they were disappointed, but technology was quietly working in the background, advancing in ways that would eventually crack this seemingly unsolvable mystery. The breakthrough arrived in 2022, 37 years after Paca carried that frozen infant to the Pelletier home. Through advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, the same techniques that had identified the Golden State Killer and dozens of other cold case perpetrators, investigators finally identified baby Jane Doe's biological parents. First, they located the father through genetic databases. Then, working backward through family trees and DNA matches, they zeroed in on the mother. Her name was Ann Daigle. In 1985, she had been Ann Garrett, a 21-year-old woman living in the Caribou and Frenchville area of northern Maine. But by 2022, she was 58 years old and living in Lowell, Massachusetts, where she had built what appeared to be a stable, normal life. She had 2 daughters whom she had successfully raised. She was described by those who knew her as a good mother, grandmother, sister, and friend. She attended family events, celebrated holidays, lived a quiet life that gave no indication of the secret she had been carrying for nearly 4 decades. On June 13, 2022, Massachusetts and Maine law enforcement arrived at Daigle's home in Lowell. She was arrested without incident, waived extradition, and was transported back to Maine to face justice for something she had done when many of her current friends and neighbors hadn't even been born yet. She was initially charged with murder by an Aroostook County grand jury. The community that had waited so long for answers finally had a name, finally had someone to direct their questions toward, finally had the possibility of understanding why. But understanding why would prove more complicated than anyone anticipated. As Daigle's case moved through the legal system, competing narratives emerged about what happened on that December night in 1985. The state's version, presented by prosecutors, painted a picture of a young woman who made conscious, calculated decisions that prioritized her own interests over her child's life. Assistant Attorney General Lindsay Russell argued that Daigle had hidden her pregnancy with loose clothing, pretending nothing was wrong even as she progressed through 9 months of gestation. She had access to several options in her northern Maine community, Russell pointed out during sentencing hearings. There were adoption agencies available. She was surrounded by family members. the same loved ones who would later appear in court to support her during her trial. But instead, she hid her pregnancy with loose clothes and pretended nothing was amiss, Russell continued. Her self-interest and embarrassment outweighed the life of her baby. She made a conscious choice. She chose to abandon her baby and let her die. But then Daigle's defense attorneys presented a dramatically different narrative, one that challenged the prosecution's characterization of cold-blooded abandonment. Attorney Adam Swanson argued that Daigle had experienced what's known as cryptic pregnancy, or pregnancy denial, a rare but documented psychological condition where a woman doesn't realize she's pregnant. According to the defense, not only was Daigle unaware of her condition, but those closest to her, including her significant other, with whom she had been intimate less than a month before giving birth, saw none of the telltale signs of pregnancy. No weight gain, no morning sickness, no behavioral changes, nothing. On the night of December 7, 1985, Daigle was driving home late when she suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to use the restroom. She pulled into the gravel pit for privacy. What happened next, according to her defense team, was a medical emergency that a frightened, naive 21-year-old was completely unprepared to handle. She was alone, terrified, and in shock, Swanson told the court. She was frightened, confused, and had just given birth to a baby, a major health event. The defense argued that Daigle genuinely believed the baby was stillborn, that in her panicked post-birth state, she didn't recognize signs of life, that her actions, while tragic, weren't the calculated abandonment the prosecution described, but rather the confused response of someone in medical and psychological crisis. The trial became a battleground over these competing narratives. Could someone truly go through 9 months of pregnancy without knowing? Medical experts would testify that, yes, while rare cryptic pregnancies do occur, particularly in women who continue having irregular periods or who attribute pregnancy symptoms to other causes. But could someone give birth and genuinely not recognize that the baby was alive? That question proved more difficult to answer with certainty. On April 6, 2023, Daigle entered a guilty plea to manslaughter, a Class A felony, in Aroostook County Superior Court. The plea was open, meaning there was no pre-negotiated sentence. Her fate would rest entirely in Judge Stephen Nelson's hands. The sentencing hearing held on June 20, 2023, became an emotional crucible where decades of grief, anger, confusion, and competing versions of truth collided. Daigle's 2 daughters testified on her behalf, describing a loving mother who had given them stability, support, and unconditional love throughout their lives. They spoke of birthday celebrations, school events, graduations, all the moments that baby Jane Doe would never experience. The testimony created a painful contrast. Here was evidence that Daigle was capable of devoted motherhood, which made her actions toward her first child even more incomprehensible. When Daigle herself addressed the court, emotion overwhelmed her. "Not a day goes by that I wish I hadn't done more," she said through tears. "That night, I was in a state of panic. I should have sought help in the moment. I hope you will take into consideration who I am today, who I have proven myself to be, a good daughter, sister, mother, grandmother, and friend. I made a mistake, and I will live with that. I cannot correct the past, but I can continue to move forward." She became particularly emotional when discussing her daughter's testimony, saying, "I enjoyed motherhood, and not a day goes by that I wondered if I could have raised another." But then Judge Nelson delivered a response that cut through the emotional testimony with sharp legal reasoning. He pointed out inconsistencies between Daigle's tearful courtroom statements and what she had told police during the investigation. "I'm trying to reconcile your claim at sentencing with the statements that were made to the officers during the investigation," Nelson said directly to Daigle. "They were either not accurate today at sentencing, or they were not accurate statements to the officers. There's no other option, from what the court can see." The judge's most pointed comment addressed Daigle's language choices when discussing the infant. Nelson noted that Daigle had referred to the baby as it rather than her during police interviews, a linguistic choice that suggested emotional distancing rather than the maternal connection Daigle now claimed she wished she could have had. "I would note that the evidence of the wonderful life she has given her other 2 daughters is a mitigating factor," Nelson acknowledged. However, it puts into stark contrast the opportunities that her actions took away from her first baby. Nelson also emphasized what he saw as Daigle's 37 years of silence. For 37 years, Miss Daigle did not step forward or take responsibility even when it was clear that she was the target of the investigation and would be a near certainty that she would be identified by DNA evidence. He stated, "This wasn't a case of someone haunted by guilt who came forward when their conscience could no longer bear the weight. This was someone who had maintained silence for nearly 4 decades, only acknowledging responsibility when scientific evidence left no other option." The sentence reflected the complexity and emotional weight of the case. 16 years in prison, with all but 6 years suspended, followed by 3 years of probation upon release. Daigle was ordered to begin serving her sentence immediately. She had already spent 77 days in jail following her arrest before being released on bail and house arrest while awaiting trial. Her earliest possible release date was set for November 2026. But then the case took another turn. Daigle's legal team filed an appeal, arguing that Judge Nelson had illegally incorporated modern sentencing guidelines into his analysis, rather than strictly applying the 1985 sentencing statutes that were in effect when the crime occurred. Specifically, they pointed to statutory language about considering victim age, provisions that were more explicitly defined in current law than in 1985 statutes. The appeal went first to Maine's Sentencing Review Panel, which denied it in September 2023. Undeterred, Daigle's attorneys took the case to the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. During oral arguments in May 2024, the justices appeared skeptical of Daigle's arguments. They pointed out that even the 1985 sentencing law required judges to consider victim age, even if the language wasn't as detailed as current statutes. The court devoted considerable attention to whether Nelson had violated Daigle's due process rights during sentencing, by pointing out contradictions between her apologetic statements in court and her earlier police interviews. The justices seemed to find that Nelson had appropriately questioned these inconsistencies rather than violating her rights. On May 17, 2024, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court upheld Daigle's sentence without issuing a written opinion explaining their reasoning. The 6-year sentence would stand. Daigle would remain incarcerated at the Maine Correctional Center in Windham, with her earliest release remaining November 2026. The legal journey was over. The case was closed. But then something beautiful happened in August 2025. 40 years after that December morning when Paca carried a frozen infant to the Pelletier's doorstep. Maine State Police announced that baby Jane Doe was being given a name: Lily Janelle. The choice wasn't random. Detectives who had worked the case for decades had privately called her Lily, a name meaning innocence, a fitting tribute to a child whose life ended before it truly began. Armand and Lorraine Pelletier, the couple whose dog had found her and who had always wished they could have adopted her, had said they would have named her Janelle, meaning gift from God. By combining both names, law enforcement honored both the investigators who never gave up and the family who wanted to save her. Giving her a name was just the beginning. Detectives worked with Mount Pleasant Catholic Cemetery in Bangor to locate Lily Janelle's unmarked grave, a process that required considerable effort after 40 years. Once they found it, they coordinated with the Maine State Troopers Foundation, May's funeral home in Calais, and Smet monuments in New Brunswick, Canada, to fund, design, and carve a proper gravestone. On August 5, 2025, a committal service was held at the cemetery. The original troopers and detectives who responded in 1985, including Charles Love, whose son Lieutenant Jeffrey Love now heads the Unsolved Crimes Unit, gathered alongside current state police personnel, prosecutors, cemetery workers, and everyone else whose lives had been touched by this case. They set Lily Janelle's new gravestone under the watchful gaze of a statue of St. Anne, and finally gave her the memorial she deserved. Every child deserves a name and an identity, Maine State Police stated in their announcement. It was a simple truth that had taken 40 years to fulfill. Lily Janelle finally had both. Lieutenant Jeffrey Love spoke about the personal significance of being involved in solving a case his father had started. My hero started the case, and now I get to help, a very small piece, to help bring closure. He's excited, to say the least, Love said of his father. He remembers these cases as all the retired detectives do. It was a reminder that cold cases aren't just files and cabinets. They're legacies passed from one generation of investigators to the next, each refusing to let victims be forgotten. Detective J. Pelletier, who worked in the Maine State Police Unsolved Homicide Unit and hailed from the same Frenchville area where Lily Janelle was found, had headed up the case in its final years. The fact that someone with deep roots in the community brought this investigation home carried its own poetic justice. This wasn't some distant bureaucrat checking boxes. This was someone for whom Lily Janelle's story was personal, woven into the fabric of his hometown's history. The case raises profound questions about criminal justice, mental health, and the nature of responsibility. If Daigle truly experienced cryptic pregnancy and genuinely believed her baby was stillborn, does that change the moral calculus of what happened? Or does the 37 years of silence override any sympathy for her situation in 1985? If she raised two daughters with apparent love and success, what does that tell us about human capacity for both care and cruelty? These questions don't have easy answers, which is perhaps why this case continues to generate such intense interest and emotion. The advancement of genetic genealogy technology has revolutionized cold case investigations in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1985. When Paca found Lily Janelle, the first DNA-based conviction in U.S. history had occurred just months earlier. The technique was experimental, expensive, and not widely accepted in courts. Fast forward 40 years, and DNA technology not only identifies suspects, but also exonerates the wrongly convicted, reunites birth families, and solves cases that seemed permanently closed. Brunswick genealogist Rhonda Randall explained how the process works. DNA from crime scenes is placed into ancestry-type databases, and they're looking for matches. These databases, created by companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe for people curious about their heritage, have become treasure troves for law enforcement. When someone uploads their DNA to find out if they're Irish or Italian, they're also potentially providing the missing puzzle piece that solves a decades-old homicide. This raises privacy concerns that society is still grappling with. But it's undeniable that the technology has delivered justice in cases like Lily Janelle's, where traditional investigative methods hit insurmountable walls. Maine Assistant Attorney General Lara Nomani confirmed that genetic genealogy has been used in Maine and could continue to be employed as an investigative tool in cases where we have an unidentified DNA profile for either a victim or a suspect. The technology's success rate suggests it will become increasingly common in cold case work, potentially providing answers to families who have waited decades for closure. The Frenchville community's response to the case's resolution revealed how deeply Lily Janelle's story had embedded itself in local consciousness. For nearly 40 years, residents lived with the knowledge that someone among them, or someone who had been among them, held the answers to what happened. The arrest of Daigle, who had left the area decades earlier, brought a mixture of relief and renewed sadness. Relief that the mystery was solved, but sadness that the answer didn't bring Lily Janelle back or undo the suffering she endured in her final moments. The Pelletiers, whose dog's actions set this entire investigation in motion, represent an interesting footnote in the story. Paca, their Siberian Husky, demonstrated remarkable gentleness in carrying Lily Janelle's body home without causing additional harm. Dogs have been known to exhibit protective behaviors toward human infants, and Paca's actions suggest she recognized that what she'd found required human attention. The Pelletiers had dreamed of having children, and fate delivered them a baby, just not in any way they could have imagined or wanted. Their statement that they would have named her Janelle if given the chance to adopt her speaks to their immediate emotional connection to this unknown child. Similar cases have occurred in other states, though each carries its own unique circumstances. A South Dakota woman was convicted of leaving a baby to freeze in a ditch in 1981. These cases share common elements: extreme weather, apparent desperation, and questions about what drives someone to abandon a newborn rather than seek alternatives like safe haven laws or adoption. Of course, in 1985, safe haven laws didn't exist. They emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s, specifically in response to cases of infant abandonment and neonaticide. These laws allow parents to anonymously surrender newborns at designated locations without fear of prosecution, acknowledging that providing a safe option for desperate parents protects infants from situations like what Lily Janelle faced. One can't help but wonder, if safe haven laws had existed in 1985, would Daigle have used them? If she'd known she could drop her baby at a hospital or fire station with no questions asked, would Lily Janelle have lived? We'll never know, but it's worth noting that Maine's safe haven law, enacted in 2001, has successfully protected babies since its implementation. The law specifically came about because lawmakers recognize that judgment and prosecution create barriers that desperate parents can't overcome in crisis moments. Better to save the baby and sort out the circumstances later. The psychological aspects of cryptic pregnancy deserve examination because they're central to understanding, if not excusing, what happened. Cryptic pregnancy is a documented phenomenon where women don't recognize they're pregnant despite physical changes. It occurs more commonly than most people realize, with estimates suggesting it affects somewhere between 1 in 475 to 1 in 2,500 pregnancies. Risk factors include irregular menstrual cycles, low body fat, and certain psychological conditions. Women experiencing cryptic pregnancy may attribute weight gain to other causes, confuse fetal movement with digestive issues, and genuinely not recognize the signs that seem obvious to others. But then there's the question of what happened after birth. Even accepting that Daigle might not have known she was pregnant, the defense's claim that she believed the baby was stillborn is harder to reconcile with the evidence. Newborns typically cry, move, and show obvious signs of life. Medical experts note that mistaking a living newborn for a stillborn would require either genuine medical complications, making the determination difficult, or a psychological state so dissociated that the person isn't processing reality clearly. Which scenario occurred in that gravel pit in 1985? Only Daigle knows for certain, and even her own recollections may be clouded by trauma, time, and self-preservation. The judge's observation about Daigle referring to the baby as it, rather than her, in police interviews touches on fascinating psychological territory. Language reveals how we categorize and emotionally connect with subjects. Referring to a baby as it suggests dehumanization or emotional distance, viewing the infant as an object rather than a person. This could indicate calculated cruelty, as prosecutors suggested. But then it might also reveal profound psychological dissociation during a traumatic event. People experiencing extreme trauma sometimes describe feeling disconnected from reality, as if they're watching events happen to someone else. This dissociative state can affect how memories form and how people describe experiences later. 37 years of silence is perhaps the most damning aspect of Daigle's case. If she genuinely believed the baby was stillborn, one might expect guilt, confusion, or trauma to eventually drive her to seek answers or confession. Therapy, religious confession, deathbed revelations. There are countless paths to unburdening oneself of such a secret. Yet by all accounts, Daigle lived a normal life, raised 2 daughters, attended family functions, and gave no indication that she carried this devastating secret. Does that suggest callousness? Or does it demonstrate the human mind's remarkable capacity for compartmentalization and self-preservation? Her daughter's testimony about their loving mother creates the case's most painful contradiction. These women grew up with birthday celebrations, school support, maternal love, everything that Lily Janelle was denied. How do we reconcile the mother who abandoned her first child with the mother who successfully raised her next 2? Human psychology is complex enough to contain both versions. People change dramatically between 21 and their late 50s. The frightened, possibly dissociated young woman in the gravel pit became someone different over decades. But then, does growth and change absolve past actions? Judge Nelson clearly believed it didn't, noting that while Daigle's successful parenting was a mitigating factor, it simultaneously highlighted what Lily Janelle lost. The Maine State Police's dedication to this case exemplifies the best of law enforcement. They could have let it fade into dusty archives, accepted that some cases simply don't get solved. Instead, they preserved evidence carefully, revisited the investigation regularly, and remained open to new technological approaches. When genetic genealogy emerged as a viable tool, they were ready to employ it. This persistence across generations of investigators, from Charles Love's initial response in 1985 to his son Jeffrey Love's involvement in the final resolution, demonstrates institutional commitment to justice that transcends individual careers. The case also highlights broader issues about reproductive health care access, social stigma around pregnancy, and the desperate situations that lead to neonaticide and infant abandonment. In 1985, Maine, particularly in rural communities like Frenchville, social stigma around unmarried pregnancy remained significant. Resources for pregnant women facing difficult circumstances existed, but weren't always easily accessible or well publicized. Fear of judgment, family shame, and limited support systems create conditions where desperate actions seem like the only option. This doesn't excuse what happened to Lily Janelle, but it provides context for understanding how such tragedies occur. Modern safe haven laws, better sex education, improved access to contraception and reproductive health care, reduced social stigma, and more robust support systems for pregnant women all help prevent situations where someone feels so desperate that abandoning a newborn seems like a viable choice. Society has made progress on these fronts since 1985, though clearly more work remains. Lily Janelle's new gravestone stands as a physical reminder that even 40 years later, justice and recognition can arrive. The inscription honors her brief existence and ensures that future generations will know her story. The cemetery location under St. Anne's watchful statue provides spiritual comfort for those who believe such things matter, whether one subscribes to religious interpretations or not. There's something meaningful about transforming an unmarked grave into a memorial that acknowledges a life, however brief. The committal service in August 2025 provided closure that the community had needed since 1985. The gathering of original responders, current investigators, prosecutors, and community members created a circle of witnesses to Lily Janelle's life and death. These ceremonies serve important psychological functions, allowing communities to collectively process grief, acknowledge suffering, and formally mark the transition from open wound to healing scar. Lieutenant Love's comment that, "We've had several successes with these unsolved cases, and we'll have several more," suggests that genetic genealogy will continue solving Maine cold cases. Each success provides hope to other families waiting for answers. Each resolution demonstrates that time doesn't necessarily mean escape for those responsible for crimes. The message is clear. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. For those interested in following more solved cold cases and supporting investigative efforts, staying informed makes a difference. Cold case squads depend on public awareness and support. When communities remember victims, when stories continue being told, pressure remains on law enforcement to pursue justice. Digital platforms allow these stories to reach wider audiences than ever before, creating networks of people invested in solving historical crimes. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. Sharing stories like Lily Janelle's serves multiple purposes: keeping her memory alive, educating people about resources available to those facing desperate situations, demonstrating that modern technology can solve seemingly impossible cases, and reinforcing societal commitment to protecting vulnerable children. Each share, each discussion, each moment of attention paid to cases like this reinforces that these victims matter, that their stories deserve telling, and that justice remains worth pursuing regardless of how much time has passed. Looking at this case through multiple lenses, legal, psychological, technological, social, reveals its complexity. There are no simple villains or heroes, just flawed humans making decisions in difficult circumstances, some trying to seek truth and justice, others trying to escape consequences. Lily Janelle remains the case's clearest victim, an innocent who never got the chance to speak for herself, whose brief existence ended in cold and darkness, but whose story ultimately reached across 40 years to demand acknowledgement and justice. The case stands as testament to persistence, technological advancement, and the fundamental principle that every life matters, regardless of how brief. Lily Janelle lived perhaps minutes or hours. She never spoke a word, never opened her eyes to see the world, never experienced love or comfort. But her existence left an indelible mark on everyone who encountered her story. The investigators who never gave up, the community that never forgot, the couple whose dog brought her home, the technology that finally identified her, the mother who must now reckon with what she did or didn't do on that December night. And now, finally, the gravestone that declares to the world, here lies Lily Janelle, innocent, gift from God, remembered. 40 years is a long time to wait for a name. 40 years is a long time to carry a secret. 40 years is a long time to pursue justice. But in the end, time proved insufficient to bury the truth. Lily Janelle's story emerged from decades of silence to deliver a message that resonates beyond this single case. Every child deserves protection, every victim deserves justice, and every story deserves its ending.